speaker for today, Albert Azis-Clauson.
Thanks very much. Hello. Before I get started, everybody stand up. I feel like we've all been sitting down, concentrating very hard for a long time. I'll go over to do it. Thank you very much. I'm also going to take a photo of everybody. Everybody smile. Absolutely nailed it. Okay, sit down. It's about me now. Thank you very much for having me. It's really exciting to be here in Gibraltar. I've never been before. A very cool, small, weird, and wonderful country. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm really excited to be here to be talking about this. I am very passionate about what I do and very excited about absolutely everything. Two quick apologies. Number one, I slept about an hour last night because I have a terrible fever. Paracetamol is just about holding me together, but I apologize if I'm a bit slow. And number two, on all the promotional images, I know I had beautiful long locks of hair that I no longer have. I apologize for catfishing you all. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about building businesses in the age of AI, how to get ahead of the adoption curve and where to invest. What does that actually mean? Well, I'm going to talk a bit about this later. We kind of know what the future of AI looks like, the rough shape of it. What we don't know is how it will be adopted, when, by who, where, which companies, where to invest, what bets to make. And I think traditional venture capital has given us a kind of tainted view of how we think about that. We make these kind of bold, crazy bets around $1 billion is the old number. I think that number will go up in the new economy. And one of them will be very, very successful and we'll have our new metas of the world. The reality, I think, is very different. And the way that I like to think about it is you spend 70% of your time, effort, and attention and money on solving problems today that can actually be solved and can actually be monetized, it can actually improve lives. And you spend 30% of your time, effort, and money thinking about how you do that in the future and what that looks like. So a little bit about me. I won't be too indulgent as much as I'd like to be. I grew up as a ballet dancer. I went to the Royal Ballet, very different to ending up in AI. I handed in my ballet shoes and changed it for a laptop and studied computer science and started building companies. At the age of 21, some fool gave me £1 million. I lost it quite quickly. And then I continued to lose people money for a while. By the time I was 28, I'd raised over 100 million across dozens of pre-Series A companies. I'd had a few exits. I'd been advising the British government. I'd been a judge of the Great British Entrepreneur Awards. And I'd done kind of everything you can do, both winning and losing in the world of entrepreneurialism. One of the things that really stood out to me was that money was disproportionately given to a certain demographic of people, mostly young white men who were arrogant and loud, not that I was that. And that didn't really make a lot of sense to me because actually people in industry, people with actual domain expertise, I love that that phrase has been used so much, are hugely diverse. So I started looking at how I could build better systems and infrastructure to build successful businesses. And I started doing angel investing. I absolutely hated it. Turns out I don't have the character to be on that side of the table. I get too overexcited and I'd invest in everything if I was given the opportunity. And I'd give advice to everyone and I'd have absolutely no time. So I started looking at how you could build infrastructure around domain expertise. These people were generally a bit more mature than I was. They were generally a little bit more level-headed, a little bit more risk-averse. They had bigger commercial networks. They understood their industry and the problems that were happening inside their industry. And they seemed to me to be the perfect people to build venture scale businesses. And yet none of them were getting money. They were building amazing consultancies. They were doing fantastically in industry, but very rarely were they actually building venture-sized companies. It tended to be young CEOs who had no idea how to run companies, but were bold enough and risk-hungry enough to gamble for $1 billion. Bearing in mind, less than 1% of venture businesses ever make it to success, let alone to a £1 billion or $1 billion valuation. And that was the foundation of what I do now. So that led me to building a piece of infrastructure that was focused on investing as little as humanly possible to build as much success as humanly possible. Now, I won't bore you with all the boring economics of how Tramlines works and how I think about building businesses, but when you attach that to AI, it becomes fundamentally faster, better, more efficient. The need for capital, the barriers to entry in markets in software have almost disappeared, and in hardware are drastically and rapidly reducing. So what am I going to talk about today in actual content? Well, I thought about this a bit, and I was going to bore you with loads of detail about how I build AI infrastructure. But what I realized was, actually what I'd like is for you to be able to go to the pub and talk about AI and sound like you know what you're talking about. I feel like there's been a lot of really deep conversation about ethics and infrastructure and orchestration and evaluation. And these are things you'll have to learn if you actually want to deliver AI into your companies and into your industries. But I want to go back a couple of steps and really kind of focus on what actually is it conceptually. Now, I'm going to be almost deliberately inaccurate in some of these explanations because they're useful in order to understand how it works. So forgive my simplicity, and I hope it isn't patronizing. I may talk a bit about the Tramlines model at the end, but to be honest, I don't think it's that interesting to you guys. So I'm going to focus much more on the AI section and then open it up, hopefully with some time for questions. So what is generative AI? A phrase that keeps popping up today is a use of an LLM. You can't just use an LLM. You can't use a raw LLM by itself. It's part of a piece of infrastructure, and that piece of infrastructure is known as an agent. And I like to think of an agent as being built of three things: a brain, a memory, and an interface. So when you use ChatGPT, the brain is whichever LLM you're using, 4 point whatever. The memory is the internet, and the interface is the chat box that you're kind of using it through. So every single time you open a new chat, you are creating a new agent. Every time you create a new project, you're creating a new agent. Every instance of interaction that has its own system and its own data is a new agent, which is a really important thing to think about, because really what you're interacting with are these three things. Now I'm going to explain each one in a very short and discrete way. Brain. A brain is an LLM. I've put /SLM. I'll get to that in a second. An LLM, very, very simply, is a predicting engine. It takes a bunch of points of data and relates them to other points of data and makes a guess. If you think of an old Cartesian graph, x, y, 3x, 4y, that's very close to 3x, 5y. So those 2 points are close together. Whereas words will have tens of thousands of those parameters in an LLM, and that will be used as a prediction engine. On top of that is layered a lot more complexity, but really that's all it is. It's a prediction engine that's then attached to memory, that's then attached to an interface. Now that memory might be documents on your computer. It might be the internet. It might be just one document. If you ever use the Adobe Acrobat, like search this document thing, that's all it's using, that single document attached to an LLM. Now, to use those effectively, as many people have pointed out, you need a very high level of orchestration and evaluation, which is why I've added in the SLM. Increasingly, we are starting to see SLMs become prevalent, particularly in niche industries. So if you're a lawyer, there's a few lawyers who have been talking today, the word contract has a very different meaning to if you're a politician. A social contract and a contract with society is very, very different to a commercial contract. And therefore, an LLM's generalist use of the word contract isn't highly specific. So you have to orchestrate the rules around it to make sure that it gives you the answers that you want, which is very complicated. Increasingly, and SLMs are being developed more and more cheaply, and I know that Great Wave are moving into the commoditization of SLMs, that will allow you to train it only on the specific use of language from your industry, which drastically reduces the amount of parameters that you have to think about. But very, very simply, this is how you think about an agent. AI is always these three things. And when we talk about clusters of agents or orchestration, all we're saying is that the interface piece is another agent. It's one agent talking to another agent rather than talking directly to me. I don't know if anyone's used Perplexity Computer, but when you ask it a question, it creates dozens of agents attached to different SLMs, and various other forms of generative AI to build you a piece of infrastructure to deliver an answer. But it's a really nice, simple way that when someone says, well, how does AI actually work? That's how it works. Very simply, that's how each instance of AI works. So does anyone know what that picture, very pixelated picture is? It is an etching from a very famous economist. I'll leave that for you to guess who it is. It's of a pin factory, if you needed a further clue. And it's all about specialization. It was a massive economic moment when we realized that the specialization of labor creates efficiency. And we can think about AI in a very, very similar way. If we go back to the previous point of what is an agent, well, the more generalist an agent is, the less effective it is. The more chance there is of it hallucinating. There's more chance there is of it making a mistake. So if we create our agents with a high level of specificity, highly specific jobs, highly specific data, highly specific SLMs, highly specific interfaces, we create more efficient agents. Now, if we think about that on a factory line, whether we're creating a pin or doing a contract for a commercial contract, what we want is that every step that is slightly different to have its own specific agent delivering its own specific result. So rather than thinking about this generalist AI that we're talking to, what we're actually talking to is either a cluster or a string of agents that have hyper-specific jobs and deliver them in an incredibly specific and efficient way. The more specific the job, the more specific the output, the better. Now, you might have what's called orchestration agents on top of that are deliberately more generalist, and they ask questions of the hyper-specific agents. Somewhat like you might think of a senior leadership team going to an analyst and asking, what does this number mean? And what does it mean within the data set that you're looking at? So what's really important here is that when you move from this idea of a specific agent or a specific piece of AI to systems of agents, what you start to think about is, how do I apply a specific solution to a specific problem? Not dissimilarly to how you would with people. When we hire people, we hire them to do specific roles. They might do multiple roles, but we hire them with a very specific output. The clearer the objective, the clearer the evaluation, the clearer the agent that's built, the better the output. The better you understand the workflow, the more easily you can create those specific agents to solve those problems. So I think at its very basis, if you don't remember anything else, it's quite nice to think of, well, AI really is a prediction engine attached to a piece of memory, attached to an interface, and we can string multiple of those agents together to do more complex tasks. At its basis, that's really all we're talking about at this point. We are not talking about something that is more complicated than that. Right. So this is something that a lot of people have brought up as a tool, not a product. I have a real gripe with people saying that we're an AI company. There are a pretty small number of AI companies in existence, and they do one of two things. They either build infrastructure, like the hyperscalers who are actually building LLMs, or they build orchestration layers like Great Wave AI, who are orchestrating those various systems to build agnostic output. So whether you're using it for law or government or military, it doesn't really matter because it's an orchestration layer on top of those utility layers. And the reason that I say that is, if you are a data privacy company or a legal company and you say you're a legal AI company, it's kind of like saying you're a legal email company. We use email and therefore we're a legal email company. And I think we get into this habit of going, well, I'm going to put AI on the end, especially because then Albert might give me some money. And everyone loves AI at the moment, so that feels like a good idea. And I think that is a real problem for me, because what it means is that we start talking about legal AI companies as opposed to companies solving real legal problems or real commercial problems within the legal industry who are using AI to solve those problems, which is a very, very different thing. And at this juncture of the evolution of AI, there are very, very, very few places where AI is not being used as a tool. And what does this actually mean in how you approach building AI, or how you approach adopting AI, or how you approach investing in AI? Well, you start with, and I know that Sam said this in his talk, you start with use cases. You start with, what problems am I actually trying to solve? And I think a lot of people, particularly younger people, but people more broadly, go into this idea of AI. I'm really excited about AI. How do I adopt it? How do I build AI companies? Well, don't. Find problems in your industry, find problems in your company, find problems in your life, and see where AI can be applied. One of my favorite things that Great Wave used to do, I do a lot of work with Great Wave and invested in Great Wave, which is why I know a bit about them. But the CEO used to say, when he used to go to big boardrooms and go, is it AI or magic? And the CEO would go, I want to do this. And he'd go, that's magic, because it was impossible. AI didn't do that. And if it could, it would do it very, very, very badly. And I always loved that, because it was this whole idea of, tell me a problem you have, tell me something you think AI can do, and I'll tell you whether that's AI or magic. And I think the ethos of it was, don't start with AI as the thing you want, start with the problem you want to solve and see what the application of AI can be to solve that problem. So if we go backwards again a couple steps, we've got this idea of a single agent. Maybe we have a single, very simple problem. I want to summarize a document. Well, all I need to do to summarize a document is have an LLM, ideally an SLM if it's a very specific thing, attached to that document and any other context around that document that might be useful, and an interface that's easy to understand, some parameters of what I want out of it. Great. That is a really good, very simple solution that poses no evolutionary risks to humanity. And I think that is like where you start. You don't start with how will AI be applied in my industry? Way too far, way too quick, way too complicated. The answer is you don't know. But if you start with these simple problems and build out workflows that get more and more complex and more difficult and more valuable and more efficient, then you start to build something that's really valuable. Thinking about some of the things that people have been talking about, jobs. And, I think one of the real important parts to this is, up until now, the value equation, the economic value equation was basically people's effort times time equals value. You apply things like SaaS or modern ways of working or modern ways of thinking, and you increase the efficiency of that. So you multiply the effort time by those things, you make it a bit better. But fundamentally, that was the equation. That equation has fundamentally changed. And it hasn't changed in every industry. It definitely hasn't changed in every work instance, but it has changed. It has changed to human cognition times by agentic architecture equals value. What does that mean? Well, very simply, if you are a senior person, this is the example that's been used, you are a senior lawyer or a senior executive, you can now replace many of the functions of junior people in your teams with AI. Now, that doesn't have a limit to it. You can continue to do that as much as you want. So the idea is that each individual can drastically increase their output by attaching themselves to this agentic architecture. Now, I'm going to come onto that in more detail in a second, but what does that actually mean? Well, it means that junior people's skills and what they need to do to deliver value fundamentally changes. You're absolutely right, whoever it was that said before, you learn a lot about being a lawyer from summarizing complex legal documents because you have to intellectually engage with them, and you won't have to do that in the future. Well, there will be an element of, we still teach woodwork, not many people do woodwork, but there's an importance to understanding skills and the intellectual rigor of understanding how things work. I believe people will still write in coding languages long after we stop writing in coding languages in commercial environments, because understanding the principles and the infrastructure and the architecture of things is fundamentally important. But what it allows is for those individuals, when they go into work, to be doing different jobs that have higher value outputs. And I believe there is a real opportunity for drastically compounding the value that can be created in an economy. So where is it going? Right now, AI is a tool. That's all it is. There are tiny examples of where it's gone beyond being a tool, but not really. Really what it is in some people are applying agents in their various forms or in their various clusters, their various architecture, in various ways to solve various problems. Increasingly efficiently and increasingly without error. And with the introduction of SLMs, I think that proliferation will happen drastically even more. But let's think about that point around the value equation. And I'm going to describe how organizations work. And hopefully you agree, but no one else has a microphone, so it'll be hard to disagree loudly enough. You can come disagree very quietly with me in the corner. Organizations really simply are hierarchical structures of people. We amplify our value by attaching ourselves to more people, therefore more effort and more time that is amplified. Some of those are more amplifying than others. We all have departments that work better than other departments, but at its core, we build bigger organizations that produce larger amounts of value. The idea of having $1 billion company that didn't have a few hundred, a few thousand employees was mental 3 years ago. Not so mental now, but staying on the path we're on. Hierarchical organizations of people, and that's how we amplify value. Currently, those hierarchical organizations of people sit on a utility layer of software infrastructure. ERP, CRM, SharePoint, all these different softwares you use to access the various data in the various ways that you need to do your work. Your accountant might be using Xero, and all of their financial data is surfaced through the static software that is Xero that is configured for your business. So you have this utility layer of infrastructure. Then underneath that, you have what's called a data lake. And the data lake holds all of the company's data. Now, most data lakes are very terribly built. They're usually not very well organized. But all of your data, probably, for most people in this room, sits on the cloud. For some of you, maybe it still sits on-prem. But it's unlikely to be in cabinets, I hope. Although there may be some exceptions. My recent run-ins with the NHS have taught me that a lot of it is still on paper. But you have this data lake. And what's really interesting about that is that a maximum of 10% of that data is surfaced through that software layer. So of all of the data you have inside your business, even if you're a small business, only 10% is surfaced through the bits of software you use to build, manage, and run your business. It's a tiny percentage. Now, what is going to happen in the future? And this is the fundamental infrastructural systemic, to the word someone used earlier and disagreed with, systemic change in how we build businesses, is we will move from this hierarchical organization of people sitting on an infrastructure utility layer of software, extracting from a data lake, to a mobile and agile, agentic architectural or orchestrated infrastructure. Hopefully the words sound more meaningful in the future, that sits alongside your business. Now, what does that mean? Every business has business logic, it has data, it has processes, it has embedded knowledge and systems and how it works. And currently those are only embedded in people and written in documents, but only embedded in people who have access to software. The fundamental difference of complex, large-scale, agentic orchestrated infrastructure is that it is mobile, agile, and it can access 100% of that data at any time. So rather than having zero, a static piece of software, you have an agentic orchestrated finance department that surfaces the right information to the right people at the right time in the right way. Now, that is broadly agreed by most frontier academics in this space. That is what things will look like in the future. How? When? The exact form? No one knows. And if they say they know, then they are absolutely lying to you. We know the fuzzy shape, that we will have these agentic orchestrated systems that sit alongside our businesses and have access to all of this data, but we don't really know when industries will start to change. There's been loads of examples in the talks we've had today of why people wouldn't adopt it yet, or why it wouldn't work well enough, or why it needs to be checked too many times. And slowly but surely, we will start to let go of some of those things. Some we will never let go of. But we'll start to build these effective agentic organizations that sit alongside our human organizations and have access to all of this data. And a quick point on that kind of idea of hiring, this will mean that our customers get more time with experts, not less. It means that the people at the front of the company will spend more time with their customers and clients. I think where I've seen the biggest failure in companies that we've thankfully not worked with is where they've tried to adopt AI as the front of the company. It is a productization, it is a product unto itself. Well, no, I'd much rather work with a person. If AI allows a person to work with 20 people instead of one, then that is the best use of it. And just somebody earlier made the comment around just 5% increase of efficiency, just 10%, just 15, just 20, just 30, just 40, just 50, until suddenly we're 500% more efficient because we're starting to do this multiplication effect. What is really important is that there is a fundamental difference between these two stages. AI as a tool increases efficiency. It doesn't multiply value. In fact, it increases efficiency in a very similar way to the way SaaS increases efficiency. It allows you to facilitate a job faster, more effectively, maybe with more accuracy, with fewer people at lower cost. But fundamentally, it is a tool that is being used to create efficiency. And the challenge to the person that said that systemic changes will not happen is that the fundamental change will be, it'll start to create value. It'll start to create value. Let me change that. It will amplify value to the point where it is creating its own value. So a law firm of 3 people could have a similar scale commercially in terms of its impact as a law firm with 100 people. Now, there will be limits to that, and I have no idea what the limits are. And we'll all work out what the limits are together as friends. But fundamentally, we will change the way that infrastructure works and therefore how value is created. Now, as we are in GIB, as I now know it's called, there is it's a great name. There's a real opportunity for places like this because small, powerful, affluent economies with high levels of skill have the ability to compete on international stages for the first time. Your size of population has no barrier to your competition. In fact, it is an asset because your ability to educate people, to invest in education, events like this, to invest in industry, to bring AI to people, and to bring industry from outside Gib into the industry here is a huge opportunity to accelerate in a way that embedded industries in other economies just can't, and they just can't move as fast. And so there's a real opportunity to participate in that at a much faster rate. So one of the things that's really important, I've forgotten what my next slide is. One of the things that's, I'm going to leave it. One of the things that's really important is that how do we know when that shift is happening? And the simple answer is we absolutely do not. And if we try and guess, you will almost certainly lose the money you've invested in that guess. And this comes back to the traditional venture model. There will be two winners traditionally in this revolution, this industrialization of AI. The first winner will be hyperscalers, Microsoft, Amazon, etc., Anthropic, who can afford to waste money in R&D, being in lots of places at the same time, knowing that one of those places will be the right place at the right time, and they will then own a bit of that market. The second is traditional venture capital, which I'm not a fan of. Read my LinkedIn posts. But the core thesis behind this is we'll make 1,000 bets, and probably in young, risk-hungry white men, mostly, and a few of them will be really successful. Hopefully 1%, more likely 0.1%, more statistically accurately 0.0001%. And whichever ones those are, they'll be massive success. So we'll get a meta if we invest in enough things. Now the reality is that will be across many investors. 60% of European VCs return 1x after 10 years. If you don't account for inflation and interest, it's a pretty bad return anyway. But the point being that unless you can invest in that scale and have disproportionately good access to the right kinds of founders who have the right kinds of access, it's not a very good model for betting on the future. For most people in the room, it's a completely inaccessible model. So how do you participate in this future? Well, there is a third category that's never really existed before. Domain expertise and access to industry. AI amplifies individuals. So if you are a domain expert, that is the one defensible asset left in this economy. I can build any software any person in this room has built in 48 hours. I guarantee you, by myself. 100%. What I cannot do is become a lawyer who has dealt with 150 clients. What I cannot do is build the connections with all the commercial companies that I work with doing international litigation. What I cannot do is understand the tacit knowledge of how people like to be talked to. I cannot emulate those things. And so for the first time in history, technology is not the barrier to entry. It is domain expertise, tacit knowledge, and access to networks. So what does that mean for participating? It means that if you are a domain expert, whether you are 25, 65, or anywhere above or below, you have the ability to start embedding that domain expertise in AI. First and foremost, as a tool to slowly but surely improve the efficiency of how you operate and deliver your work. Over time, you will be there when that industrialization happens. You cannot force the industrialization. You can educate people, you can try and sell things more cheaply, you can trick people into products they don't want, you can sell people a product that's actually something else, but fundamentally, brownfield technology transformation, the industrialization of any technology takes time. Now, it might be true that 100 million people were using ChatGPT within 2 months is a good stat. But what is also true, is that no company is using it as an infrastructural level at any real scale. You know, if you look at Great Waves' work, sorry Sam, I'm going to keep picking on you. If you look at Great Waves' work with like the British government or with law firms, what you're actually seeing is a slow and painful process of teasing out case studies and solving problem after problem after problem as they slowly but surely adopt culture. People have mentioned procurement problems, people, culture, adoption rates, understanding, the way that infrastructure, the opportunity cost of converting infrastructure, all of these are problems that have to be surmounted. You can't guess when any company or any industry will surmount them. What you can do is be present, solving problems with a domain expert focus, and then be therefore ready as that industrialization happens. And that is fundamentally where people should be thinking, looking, and investing. So when you go back to what I was saying at the very, very beginning, 70% of your time, effort, money, thinking should be around solving specific problems using AI that actually help, and maybe not using AI. I think there is this real impetus that you have to use AI as the only way to solve a problem. Often it's not the best way to solve a problem. If you have structured data and you're comparing it with structured data, don't use AI. Like, that's not a good use case. And there's loads of use cases like that. Think of it as another new tool in your palette, probably the most valuable, probably the one you'll end up using most, but don't assume that at the beginning. So start off by really embedding that in that 70%. How do I slowly but surely get 5%, 10%, 20%? But start thinking about, what does that infrastructural change look like? Because eventually, every piece of static software that you use will be replaced with agentic orchestrated infrastructure. And that will happen over time. Right, I'm going to wrap up so we can have some questions. Let's go straight through. I'll just summarize everything. So basically, I'd like to get to questions, and I'm not going to talk to you about Tramlines. You can look us up. We do some really cool stuff. But the most important thing for me is when somebody later at the pub or in a cafe, tea or beer, says, what is AI to you? You go, well, actually, it's a pretty simple piece of system. It's a prediction engine that's attached to a memory of things, a bit of data that has an interface. And sometimes you string them together to make a more complex workflow that solves a more complex problem. That's all it is. And then if someone says, well, how do you use it? Well, I think about it in the sense of, I have efficiency problems. I've got too many clients, or I want to find new clients, or this process takes a long time, or the person that solves this problem is expensive. And I've gone and I've mapped out all the workflows that I do, and then I've seen where AI can make those workflows more efficient. But the really interesting thing is this piece about the industrialization of AI. And in the future, we're going to replace all these static bits of software we use that access a tiny bit of data with these agile, kind of mobile, orchestrated systems that have access to all of my data. And so when I ask it a question about finance, it goes and finds the finance cluster, finds the number that I want, and delivers it to me. And that's where the future is going. And me personally, I'm investing all of my time, effort, and money into domain expertise, into downloading domain expertise in as much detail as humanly possible. And there is a really important window of opportunity. If you're one of the students, I think I had to leave, but if you're one of the students at the back, this is an opportunity to go and talk to people who have been in industry and learn as much as humanly possible about how you could help them download their domain expertise and solve their problems. I think there is a big impetus to go and build something new. For the first time, anyone can build something new. If you're trying to compete with other people by solving a problem you've seen, you're unlikely to be successful. If you try and compete with other people by going and find people who have disproportionate knowledge of their industry, even better if they're laggard industries that don't naturally adopt AI quickly, and you go and download as much information as possible from those industries and build it into first utilities, tools that make efficiency using AI, and eventually that industrialization piece. And that is where I am seeing the most important investment of time, effort, and money. I realize that everything has been running over a bit, and I feel like I've covered all the key points, so I thought I'd hand it over to questions, if that's okay. Thank you very much.